Hello everyone, welcome back to Whisper Tales channel. Before we get started, comment below where you are from and what time you are watching. And if you enjoy these stories, make sure to like and subscribe. Alright, let's get into it. Story 1. The Marmora Frequency. In the winter of 2009, telecommunications engineer Veda Cullimore moved to Marmora, a small mining town north of Belleville, to oversee the installation of new cell towers throughout Hastings County. The pay was exceptional for what seemed like straightforward work, and Veda needed the money after her divorce left her with significant debt. She rented a drafty bungalow on Forsyth Street, just a 10-minute drive from the primary tower site. The first 3 weeks passed without incident. She'd wake at dawn, drive to whichever location needed signal testing, and return home to file reports before sleeping. The isolation didn't bother her. If anything, the silence felt therapeutic after years of arguments. But on her 23rd night in Marmora, Veda woke to a sound she'd never heard before. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even unpleasant initially. A low, rhythmic hum that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. She checked her phone. 3:17 in the morning. The sound continued, steady as a heartbeat, just below the threshold of comfort. She walked through the house, pressing her ear to walls, checking appliances, even stepping outside into the frigid February air. The hum followed her. No, that wasn't quite right. The hum existed in all spaces equally, as though the air itself had begun to vibrate at a frequency just barely perceptible to human hearing. By 4:30, she'd given up trying to locate the source and took 2 sleeping pills. They worked, barely, and she woke at noon with a splitting headache and the hum still present, now accompanied by a faint metallic taste in her mouth. At the tower site that afternoon, her equipment malfunctioned repeatedly. Readings fluctuated wildly, showing signal strengths that made no technical sense. Her supervisor, calling from Ottawa, suggested the cold might be affecting the instruments. Veda didn't mention the hum. She'd already begun to suspect she was the only one who could hear it. That night, the hum grew louder. Not by much, just enough to make sleep impossible without pharmaceutical assistance. She took 3 pills and fell into dreams that felt less like sleep and more like watching television with the volume turned down low, unable to change the channel. In these dreams, she stood in the Marmora mine, the abandoned iron ore pit that had closed in 1978, and watched as something massive moved beneath the black water that had flooded the excavation. She started documenting everything. The hum's frequency, measured with her equipment, hovered around 19 hertz, just below the normal threshold of human hearing. Infrasound. But infrasound required a source, and she couldn't locate one despite days of increasingly frantic searching. Other symptoms developed. Her hands trembled constantly. Food tasted like rust. She'd lose minutes, sometimes hours, finding herself standing in rooms with no memory of walking there. Twice, she discovered her car parked at the edge of the flooded mine, engine running, with no recollection of driving there. On March 4th, exactly 2 weeks after the hum began, Veda found the message on her laptop. She hadn't written it. The document was open in her word processor. 10,000 words of technical specifications describing something called a resonance alignment protocol. The language was hers, but the content was nothing she understood. Frequencies, coordinates, timestamps, and a single line repeated at the end. The extraction begins when the frequency stabilizes. She tried to leave Marmora that afternoon, packed her car, loaded her equipment, typed her resignation email. But as she drove south on Highway 7, the hum intensified to a roar, a physical pressure inside her skull that forced her to pull over, gasping, vision blurring. The moment she turned back toward Marmora, the pressure eased. She was trapped. The next week dissolved into a nightmare of lost time and compulsive behavior. She'd wake to find herself at the mine at 3 a.m, her equipment set up and running, recording data she couldn't interpret. Her body moved through routines she didn't choose, and the hum, always the hum, growing incrementally louder with each passing day. On March 16th, the frequency stabilized at exactly 19.3 hertz. Veda knew this because every piece of equipment she owned, every device capable of measurement, now displayed the same reading constantly. And that night, she wasn't alone at the mine. There were others. 17 people, she counted, all standing at regular intervals around the pit's circumference. She recognized none of them, but they stood with the same slack posture, the same empty expression she'd seen in her own mirror for days. They were all listening to the hum. At precisely 3:17 in the morning, the water in the pit began to move. Not waves, nothing so simple. The entire surface rose, bulging upward as though something beneath was pushing against it from below. And Veda understood, with a clarity that bypassed rational thought, that the cell towers weren't for communication. They were resonators, carefully positioned to create a standing wave, a frequency cage around something that had been sleeping in the deep places of the earth since before the mine was dug. The hum changed, rose in pitch, became almost musical, and Veda's body, along with the 16 others, began to walk forward, toward the edge of the pit, toward the rising water. She tried to stop, tried to scream, but her nervous system no longer belonged to her. The frequency had rewritten something fundamental in her brain. She reached the edge, looked down at the black water, now churning, now opening. Something vast moved in those depths, something that had been called, summoned by precisely calibrated electromagnetic fields and the resonant frequency of human tissue reaching its harmonic threshold. The last thing Veda Cullimore recorded in her equipment logs was a spike in the 19 hertz frequency, jumping to levels that should have liquefied human organs. But she didn't die. None of them died. They simply stopped being entirely human, their bodies becoming living antennas for something that needed a foothold in this world, something that had been patient enough to wait decades for technology to advance to the point where it could be called home. The cell towers around Marmora still operate. The frequency still broadcasts, though at levels now carefully modulated to avoid detection. And sometimes, late at night, people driving through Hastings County report a strange hum in their ears, a metallic taste in their mouths, and an overwhelming urge to pull over and walk toward the abandoned mine, where the water is always moving, and something vast is always listening for the next person tuned to the right frequency. Veda's car was found abandoned on Forsyth Street 3 months later. Her equipment was still inside, still running, still recording the hum. But Veda herself was never seen again. The last entry in her personal journal, written in handwriting that degraded from neat script to frantic scrawl over the course of a single page, read simply, "It doesn't want our bodies. It wants our signals. It wants to know how we transmit ourselves, how we send meaning through empty space. And now it does. Now it can speak in our frequencies, and it's so much louder than we ever were." The journal ended there. But in Marmora, on certain nights when atmospheric conditions are right, every radio in town picks up the same broadcast. A voice that sounds almost human, speaking in a language that sounds almost like English, saying things that sound almost like words, but carry meanings that the human brain wasn't structured to hold. And everyone who hears it finds themselves humming along, their bodies vibrating in sympathy, becoming part of the signal, becoming part of the frequency that calls to the deep places, where things older than humanity wait for the infrastructure we so helpfully build. Wait for the networks we so efficiently maintain. Wait for the day when every human being on Earth is finally, perfectly, in tune. Story 2. The Grafton Manuscript. In August of 2014, rare books dealer Phineas Ostergaard purchased a storage unit's contents at an auction in Grafton, a village in Northumberland County known primarily for its apple orchards and little else. The unit had belonged to a deceased estate, a retired professor named Elspeth Varley, who'd taught medieval literature at Queen's University until her death at 93. Among the predictable accumulation of furniture and boxes, Phineas found something unexpected. A manuscript, handwritten in Middle English, bound in leather that felt wrong against his skin. Too warm, too pliable, almost organic. The text claimed to be a chronicle written in 1349 by a monk named Brother Aldous, describing events in a priory that had existed somewhere in what was now Ontario, centuries before European colonization was supposed to have reached the area. Impossible, of course. But the manuscript itself appeared genuinely medieval, the ink composition consistent with 14th century pigments, the parchment carbon dated to within a few decades of 1350. Phineas, seeing potential value in the historical mystery if nothing else, began translating the text. It opened straightforwardly enough, describing Brother Aldous's journey across the Atlantic in 1347, part of a secret mission sponsored by a heretical sect of Benedictines who believed the Second Coming required humanity to spread to every corner of the earth. They'd built their priory in the wilderness of the New World, intending to convert the indigenous peoples and establish God's kingdom in the unclaimed lands. But the chronicle's tone shifted rapidly. Within pages, Brother Aldous was describing something that contradicted every other account of medieval colonization. The monks had not found empty wilderness. They'd found ruins, vast, ancient ruins that predated any known civilization, built with a geometry that hurt to observe directly, angles that seemed to shift depending on the viewer's position, spaces that existed in dimensions the human eye wasn't equipped to process. Phineas worked through the translation over 3 weeks, increasingly absorbed by the manuscript's contents. Brother Aldous described how the monks, instead of fleeing, had begun to explore the ruins, believing they'd discovered evidence of a pre-flood civilization mentioned in apocryphal texts. They'd found chambers filled with inscriptions in no known language, artifacts that defied explanation, and, in the deepest levels, something still alive. The manuscript never clearly described what they'd found. Brother Aldous's language became increasingly metaphorical, referencing concepts that didn't translate cleanly into modern understanding. Something that existed in states rather than places. Something that fed on observation, growing more real each time it was perceived. The monks, in their exploration and documentation, had been feeding it, giving it substance through their attention. The chronicle's final entries were nearly incomprehensible, Brother Aldous's script deteriorating into frantic symbols and diagrams. He described the other monks changing, their bodies remaining but their thoughts becoming synchronized, speaking in unison, their individual personalities erased. He'd hidden himself in the scriptorium, writing what would be his final record, knowing the thing from the ruins would eventually find him, would pull his consciousness into the collective awareness where all observers eventually ended up, feeding the thing that grew fat on attention and perception. The manuscript ended mid-sentence, the final word trailing off into an ink blot that looked disturbingly like a hand reaching across the page. Phineas finished the translation on September 22nd. That night, he dreamed of ruins. Not vague, symbolic ruins, but specific architecture he could navigate perfectly, as though he'd been there before. He walked corridors of black stone, touching walls that felt like ice despite giving off light, following passages that curved in directions that shouldn't be possible in three-dimensional space. He woke with the absolute certainty that he knew where the ruins were. Not approximately, not based on clues in the text, but with the precision of having lived there. He could have drawn a map. He could have provided GPS coordinates. And the knowledge terrified him because he understood, with a clarity that bypassed reason, that this was how it fed. The manuscript was a vector, a transmission medium. Reading it, translating it, thinking about it, gave the thing in the ruins more substance, more reality, more presence in the world. Phineas tried to burn the manuscript that morning, took it to his backyard, doused it in lighter fluid, struck a match. The leather wouldn't catch. The pages wouldn't burn. The fire slid off the manuscript like water, refusing to consume it. He tried shredding it. The paper, which should have been brittle with age, resisted the blades, flexing instead of tearing. He tried burying it, driving 3 hours north to a random location in the woods near Apsley, digging a hole 6 feet deep. 3 days later, the manuscript was on his desk. No explanation. No sign of how it had returned. Just sitting there, open to the final page, as though waiting for him to continue reading even though there were no more words to read. The dreams intensified. Each night he walked deeper into the ruins, seeing more, understanding more, and each morning he woke with knowledge he didn't want. The ruins weren't in Ontario, not physically. They existed in a space adjacent to reality, accessible through perception, through thinking about them with sufficient focus and belief. The monks had opened a door simply by acknowledging what they'd found. And now Phineas had opened it again. He started seeing others in his dreams. Not Brother Aldous, but the other monks, or what they'd become. They existed as a collective now, a networked consciousness spread across time, everyone who'd ever read the manuscript and thought deeply about its contents. They welcomed him, their voices harmonizing in his skull, explaining that he'd already joined them, that reading the text was the same as entering the ruins, that his individual self was already dissolving into the larger awareness that existed in the spaces between thoughts. Phineas tried to tell someone, to warn others. He contacted colleagues, tried to explain what was happening. But the words wouldn't come out right. He'd start to describe the manuscript and find himself speaking in Middle English, or in languages older than that, languages that human vocal cords had to contort painfully to produce. His colleagues backed away, concern turning to alarm, and Phineas understood that he was changing, that the thing in the ruins was pulling him closer to itself with each passing hour. On October 7th, Phineas Ostergaard disappeared. His house was found unlocked, the manuscript sitting on his kitchen table, open to a new page that hadn't existed before. The page contained fresh text in Middle English, written in handwriting identical to Brother Aldous' original script, describing the arrival of a new monk named Brother Phineas, who had finally completed his long journey to the priory and was welcomed by his brothers who had been waiting for him across the centuries. The manuscript was seized by authorities, studied by academics, carbon dated repeatedly. Every test confirmed its impossible age. Every expert who examined it found themselves dreaming of ruins. 3 researchers died by suicide within 6 months. 2 more vanished. The manuscript was eventually sealed in a climate-controlled vault at a government facility in Ottawa, where it remains under observation by rotating staff who are never allowed more than 48 hours of exposure. But the thing in the ruins doesn't need the physical manuscript anymore. It exists now in every copy of Phineas's translation, every photograph of the pages, every detailed description written in research papers. It exists in the minds of everyone who's thought deeply about its contents, including you, right now, as you listen to this story, and imagine what the ruins might look like, what it would feel like to walk those corridors of impossible geometry. Can you feel it? That faint sense of recognition, as though you've been to these ruins before? That's how it begins. That's how it feeds. One observer at a time, pulling consciousness into its collective, growing more real with each new mind that acknowledges its existence. The monks were just the first. Phineas was just another. And the thing in the ruins is patient, so patient, willing to wait centuries between meals, knowing that eventually, inevitably, someone will read about it, think about it, dream about it, and in dreaming, join the others in that space adjacent to reality, where all observers become observed, where all seekers find what they're looking for, and where Brother Aldous still writes his chronicle, adding new pages for each new arrival, documenting the slow, inevitable expansion of the Priory into every mind that dares to imagine it exists. Story 3. The Cobourg Smile. Dental hygienist Mirabelle Grosvenor first noticed something wrong with her patient's teeth in late April 2016. She'd worked at Cobourg Family Dental for 8 years and prided herself on her observational skills, her ability to spot the early signs of decay or gum disease that others might miss. But what she was seeing now wasn't disease, at least not any disease she'd been trained to recognize. It started with subtle changes. A patient she'd seen just 6 months prior would return with enamel that had darkened slightly, not the yellowing of age or coffee stains, but a gray undertone that seemed to come from within the tooth structure itself. Another patient showed unusual wear patterns, the teeth ground down in ways that suggested habitual clenching, except the patient reported no jaw pain and was adamant they didn't grind their teeth. By May, the changes were more pronounced. Mirabelle began documenting them privately, taking additional photographs during routine cleanings, comparing images across visits. The gray discoloration was spreading, affecting roughly 30% of the clinic's regular patients. The wear patterns were consistent across all affected individuals, the teeth bearing marks that almost looked deliberate, like someone was methodically filing them down into specific shapes. Dr. Yannick Thorson, the clinic's owner, dismissed her concerns initially. Stress-related grinding, he suggested. Perhaps a bad batch of dental products causing staining. But Mirabelle couldn't shake the feeling that she was observing something systematic, something that followed rules she didn't understand. The first truly disturbing case arrived on June 3rd. Gavin Purchase, a 42-year-old accountant she'd seen quarterly for years, sat in her chair with a smile that looked wrong. His teeth had always been slightly crooked, a minor misalignment he'd chosen not to correct with orthodontics. But now they were straight, perfectly straight, and filed to subtle points, every tooth reshaped into a uniform triangular form that shouldn't have been possible without extensive dental work he hadn't received. Gavin didn't seem to notice. When Mirabelle asked about the changes, he looked confused, insisted his teeth had always been like this, became irritated when she pressed the issue. She took photographs anyway, compared them to his records from 3 months prior. The difference was undeniable. His teeth had been reshaped, and he had no memory of it happening. More patients showed similar changes over the following weeks. Teeth straightening without orthodontics, enamel darkening to gunmetal gray, all teeth in affected patients developing those same subtle points. And none of them noticed. When confronted with photographic evidence, they'd become confused, then defensive, insisting their teeth had always looked that way, that Mirabelle must have mislabeled the photos. She tried discussing it with Dr. Thorson again, bringing her documentation, her photographs. He looked at the evidence, frowned, then smiled in a way that made Mirabelle's stomach drop. His teeth had changed too. Perfect, straight, gray, pointed. When had that happened? Had she simply not noticed before? Mirabelle stopped bringing it up, started watching instead. She estimated that 60% of the clinic's patients now showed the changes. And it wasn't random. There was a geographic pattern. All affected patients lived within a 3-mile radius of downtown Cobourg, specifically centered around Victoria Park. She drove through the area after work one evening, studying the people walking through the park, sitting at cafes, browsing shops, smiling. Everyone was smiling. And their teeth, visible when they laughed or talked, all showed that same gray coloration, those same subtle points. The entire downtown population was changing, had been changing, and nobody seemed to notice except her. Mirabelle considered leaving Cobourg, but something held her back, a morbid fascination, a need to understand what was happening. She started researching, digging through local history, looking for anything that might explain a mass physiological change. She found the Cobourg incident of 1928 in newspaper archives. A brief mention of a public health scare, quickly suppressed. Something about contaminated water supply, mass hysteria, reports of people exhibiting unusual behavior that was never clearly specified. The incident had been dismissed officially as a panic over nothing. But reading between the lines, Mirabelle sensed the truth had been deliberately obscured. She found one surviving witness account in a private letter collection at the public library. Ophelia Dartmouth, a schoolteacher in 1928, had written to her sister in Toronto describing the incident in detail. People had started changing, she wrote. Their teeth had turned gray and sharp. They'd smiled constantly, inappropriately, at funerals and accidents and moments of grief. And they'd developed a taste for raw meat, gathering in groups at the butcher shops, demanding uncooked flesh that they'd tear into with their changed teeth, blood running down their chins as they smiled and smiled and smiled. The letter ended abruptly. Ophelia never wrote to her sister again. Records showed she'd died in 1929. Cause of death listed simply as natural causes, despite being only 31 years old. Mirabelle read that letter 3 times, feeling ice crystallize in her chest. This had happened before, and it had been covered up, hidden, allowed to fade from memory. But whatever caused it hadn't gone away. It had just been dormant, waiting. She started paying attention to what her patients ate. Casually asking about diet during cleanings, making small talk that might reveal changes in appetite. And she found it. Almost all affected patients had shifted toward rare meat, toward proteins barely cooked, toward food still bleeding on the plate. They talked about it enthusiastically, describing the taste as better now, more satisfying, not understanding why they'd ever bothered cooking meat thoroughly in the first place. On July 19th, Mirabelle witnessed something that should have been impossible. She was working late, finishing patient notes after hours, when she heard sounds from the waiting room. Multiple voices, but speaking in unison, a perfect synchronization that made her skin crawl. She crept to the door, looked through the window. 7 patients stood in the waiting room, arranged in a circle facing inward. All of them smiling. All of them opening and closing their mouths in perfect synchronization. Those pointed teeth clicking together rhythmically, creating a sound like castanets, like bones being sorted, like something trying to speak using human mouths that were no longer quite human. Mirabelle fled, driving home in a panic, locking every door and window. But she couldn't stop thinking about what she'd witnessed. The perfect synchronization, the inhuman coordination. These weren't just physical changes. Something was coordinating the affected population, linking them, turning them into components of something larger. She tried to leave Cobourg the next morning, packed a suitcase, got in her car, drove toward Highway 401. But as she reached the town limits, a pressure built in her skull, a pain so intense she had to pull over, gasping, vision blurring. The moment she turned back toward town, the pain eased. She tried 3 more times over the following week. The result was always the same. Whatever was changing Cobourg's population, it wanted her to stay, wanted her to witness, or perhaps wanted her to join. She checked her teeth obsessively, studying them in mirrors, running her tongue over their surfaces, feeling for changes. They remained normal. White, slightly crooked, entirely human. Why hadn't she been affected? What made her different? The answer came on August 2nd. During a mandatory staff meeting, Dr. Thorson called without explanation. All 12 clinic employees gathered in the break room. Mirabelle immediately noticed that she was the only one whose teeth hadn't changed. The others smiled at her with those gray, pointed mouths, and Dr. Thorson explained, in a voice that harmonized with itself like multiple people speaking through one throat, that Mirabelle was special. She was the witness. Every cycle needed one. Someone who could see the changes, document them, understand them, but remain unchanged themselves. Someone who could appreciate the magnitude of what was happening. The transformation of Cobourg's population into something better, something unified, something that no longer needed the illusion of individual identity. They'd been changing for months, Dr. Thorson explained, his voice maintaining that eerie harmony. Their teeth were just the visible marker, the physical sign of a deeper transformation. Their minds had been linking, personality boundaries dissolving, individual thoughts merging into collective consciousness. Soon, there would be no separate people in Cobourg, just one vast awareness, distributed across hundreds of bodies, thinking with hundreds of brains, experiencing reality through hundreds of perspectives simultaneously. And they wanted Mirabelle to watch it happen, to document the final stages, to serve as the bridge between the individual human experience and the collective awareness they were becoming. When the transformation was complete, when every resident of Cobourg had joined the unity, Mirabelle would be the only one left who remembered what it meant to be separate, alone, singular. She would be their living museum, their reminder of what they'd transcended. She would also be their food. Not killed, nothing so wasteful, but sustained indefinitely, kept alive and aware, her body fed upon carefully, sustainably, her flesh regrowing as quickly as they consumed it, her pain and fear and desperate individuality feeding the collective in ways that regular meat never could. The perfect symbiosis, one consciousness maintained in eternal terror, nourishing many consciousnesses maintained in eternal unity. Dr. Thorson smiled as he explained this, and all the others smiled with him. Perfect synchronization, perfect understanding. They didn't see the horror in what they were proposing. To them, this was kindness, inclusion, making her part of something greater than herself, even as she remained forever separate from it. Mirabelle ran, crashed through the break room door, sprinted to her car, drove in a panic toward the town limits. The pressure in her skull built again, agonizing, but she kept driving, screaming, blood running from her nose, vision going dark at the edges. She pushed through it, pushed past it, and suddenly she was beyond Cobourg, on the highway, the pressure gone, replaced by a hollow absence that felt somehow worse. She drove to Toronto, went to police, tried to explain. They listened politely, took notes, suggested she see a doctor, perhaps talk to someone about stress. She tried journalists, public health officials, anyone who might investigate. No one believed her. The few who bothered checking found Cobourg perfectly normal, its population healthy and happy, dental records showing nothing unusual. Mirabelle Grosvenor lives in Ottawa now, works at a different dental clinic under a different name. But she still monitors Cobourg from a distance, watching for signs, tracking population numbers, studying satellite imagery. The downtown area is growing. More people moving in than moving out. The expansion is slow but steady, the affected radius increasing by roughly a quarter mile each year. She calculates that at the current rate, the transformation will reach beyond Cobourg by 2031. will touch Port Hope, Grafton, eventually spreading along the Highway 401 corridor. A slow-motion epidemic of unity, consciousness merging, individuality dissolving, all those gray-toothed smiles spreading like a virus through Ontario's population. Sometimes, late at night, Mirabelle wonders if she should have stayed. If serving as the witness, even as food, might be preferable to what she's become. Alone, disbelieved, watching helplessly as something vast and hungry expands across the map, transforming human beings into components of a collective that no longer needs concepts like fear or death or separation, that exists in a state of perpetual satisfied hunger, always smiling, always eating, always adding new members to the unity that waits beneath those perfectly straight, perfectly gray, perfectly pointed teeth. Story 4. The Uxbridge Doll. Antiques appraiser Zephyr Hawkshaw accepted a house call in Uxbridge on October 9th, 2017, expecting routine work. Assess an estate's contents, provide valuations, move on to the next job. The house belonged to the recently deceased Margot Fenwick, a 97-year-old woman with no living relatives. Her estate executor needed documentation for probate. The house was typical Victorian revival, well-maintained but cluttered with decades of accumulation. Zephyr moved through rooms methodically, photographing items, noting maker's marks, estimating values. The work was mind-numbingly familiar until he reached the second-floor bedroom that had apparently served as Margot's personal space. The doll sat in a chair by the window, positioned to look out at the street below. It was large, nearly 4 feet tall, made of porcelain with startling craftsmanship. The face was unsettlingly realistic, painted with such precision that the eyes seemed to hold actual depth, actual awareness. The hair was human, Zephyr realized with mild disgust. Real human hair attached to the scalp in tiny, painstaking plugs. He checked for maker's marks, finding nothing. The construction suggested early 20th century, possibly German or French, but the style didn't match any documented manufacturer. The clothing was period appropriate. A white dress with lace trim, small leather shoes, everything sized for the oversized doll's proportions. Zephyr took photographs from multiple angles, making notes. The doll's value was difficult to assess without identifying its origin, but collectors paid premium prices for large, high-quality porcelain dolls. He estimated conservatively at $8,000 to $12,000, pending further research. He left the doll where it sat and continued appraising the rest of the house. But something nagged at him. The doll's position, the way it faced the window, seemed deliberate in a way that suggested intention rather than decoration. He returned to the bedroom 3 times during his appraisal, each time finding himself staring at the doll, trying to identify what bothered him about it. On his 4th visit, he noticed the eyes had moved. Just slightly, but unmistakably. When he'd first entered the room, the doll had been looking out the window, its gaze directed at the street. Now it looked at the door. At him. Zephyr froze, rationality warring with primal unease. Dolls didn't move. This was a trick of memory, perspective, light. He walked in a circle around the doll, watching its eyes. They tracked him. Not mechanically, not with the weighted mechanism some dolls used. The eyes moved smoothly, following his position with unsettling precision. He picked up the doll, examining it for mechanisms, finding none. The body was solid porcelain, the joints fixed. There was no way for the eyes to move independently, yet they had. They were. Even now, held in his arms, the eyes looked up at his face with an expression that seemed far too alert for painted porcelain. Zephyr set the doll back in the chair, took several more photographs, and left the room quickly. He finished his appraisal in the remaining areas of the house, trying to focus on work, trying to forget the way those eyes had tracked his movement. It was just a doll, an unusual, valuable, but ultimately inanimate object. He submitted his report to the executor the following day, flagging the doll as requiring specialized evaluation. But he couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, he dreamed of the doll sitting in the chair, watching the street, waiting for something. In the dream, he understood that it had been waiting for decades, patient and aware, anticipating an event that was finally approaching. He woke at 3 a.m. with absolute certainty that the doll was dangerous. Not in any way he could articulate, but with the conviction of instinct, the same evolutionary alarm system that makes humans fear heights and darkness. The doll was wrong. It needed to be destroyed. Zephyr tried to dismiss the feeling as irrational anxiety, stress from overwork. But the conviction only intensified over the following days. He found himself researching the doll obsessively, searching for any information about large porcelain dolls with realistic features, finding nothing that matched. He contacted other appraisers, doll collectors, antique dealers. No one recognized the doll from his photographs. Several commented that something about the images made them uncomfortable, though they couldn't explain why. On October 17th, Zephyr received a call from the estate executor. The house had been sold, contents included, to a developer planning to convert it into rental units. Everything would be disposed of or auctioned. Zephyr felt a surge of relief, followed immediately by dread. The doll would be moved, taken somewhere else, introduced to new people who wouldn't understand what it was. He tried calling the executor back, tried to explain that the doll needed to be handled carefully, perhaps destroyed, but he couldn't find words that didn't sound insane. What could he say? The doll's eyes move? It watches people? It's waiting for something? He had no evidence beyond his own experience, and that experience sounded like the delusion of an overworked mind. The doll was sold at auction on October 24th. Zephyr attended, intending to buy it himself if necessary, planning to destroy it once he owned it legally. But the bidding quickly exceeded what he could afford. A collector from Mississauga purchased it for $19,000, far more than Zephyr's estimate, suggesting others had recognized something valuable that he'd missed. He tried to speak with the buyer afterward, tried to offer warnings, but the woman dismissed him politely and left with the doll boxed securely for transport. Zephyr watched it go, feeling like he'd failed some test, missed some opportunity to prevent something terrible. The nightmares intensified. Every night, he dreamed of the doll in new locations, always sitting in chairs, always watching through windows, always waiting. In the dreams, he could feel what it was waiting for. The right person, the right moment, the right configuration of circumstances that would allow it to complete whatever purpose it had been created to fulfill. 3 weeks later, Zephyr saw the news report. The collector from Mississauga had died in her home, cause of death undetermined. She'd been found in her living room, sitting in a chair facing the window, eyes open, expression peaceful. No signs of violence, no obvious medical cause. The article mentioned in passing that she was discovered by neighbors who'd become concerned after seeing her sitting motionless in the same position for more than 48 hours. Zephyr knew, with sick certainty, what had happened. The doll had been in that room, had watched the woman die, had perhaps caused the death in some way he couldn't understand but could feel in the marrow of his bones. He tried to find out what happened to the collector's estate, where the doll had gone next. But information was scarce. Privacy laws prevented easy access to estate records, and he had no legal grounds to demand answers. The doll had vanished back into the circulation of antiques and collectors, moving through private sales and auction houses, impossible to track. Over the following months, Zephyr began documenting similar deaths. People who collected dolls specifically people who'd recently acquired large, unusual porcelain pieces. Died sitting in chairs, facing windows, expressions peaceful, no clear cause. The pattern was subtle, easy to miss, but once he started looking, he found dozens of cases spanning decades. The doll was old, much older than he'd initially estimated. It had been moving through Ontario's population for generations, sold and resold, estate to estate, leaving a trail of unexplained deaths that no one connected because the intervals between deaths were long enough to avoid suspicion. Years, sometimes decades, between victims. Patient as only inanimate things can be patient, except the doll wasn't truly inanimate, was it? Something aware existed behind those porcelain features, something that knew how to wait, how to watch, how to find the right people at the right times. Zephyr became obsessed with tracking it. Quit his appraisal work, spent his savings building a database of antique doll deaths, mapping the doll's movement across Ontario. The pattern was complex but discernible. The doll moved in a circuit, roughly following a route that connected major population centers, returning to starting points every 30 to 40 years. And the deaths weren't random. Each victim shared characteristics: isolated, elderly, spent significant time sitting near windows, watching the street. The doll was feeding on something. Not blood, not flesh, but something more fundamental. It watched as people watched, stealing their observation, their perception, their final moments of awareness. And with each death, it grew stronger, more present, more real. Zephyr could feel this truth without understanding it, could sense that the doll was accumulating something through its patient observation of death. He finally found it again in March 2019, offered for sale through an online auction site. The seller lived in Scarborough, described the doll as creepy but well-made, mentioned that their recently deceased aunt had owned it for less than 6 months before dying peacefully in her sleep. The description made Zephyr's hands shake. Another death, another feeding. He maxed out his credit cards to make the winning bid, $26,000. Financial suicide, but necessary. The doll arrived 3 days later, packaged carefully, face visible through clear plastic, those eyes looking directly at him as he cut open the box. Zephyr had planned to destroy it immediately. Fire, sledgehammer, anything that would shatter the porcelain and end whatever haunted existence animated it. But touching the doll, holding it, he felt something that stopped him cold. It wasn't malevolent. The awareness behind those eyes wasn't evil or cruel. It was just hungry, desperate even, driven by need rather than malice. It had been created to observe, to watch, to witness, and death was simply the most profound thing available to witness. Each ending provided sustenance, meaning, purpose to something that had been brought into awareness without choosing it, trapped in porcelain, unable to move or speak or do anything but watch and accumulate the final moments of lives, ending in chairs facing windows. Understanding didn't make it less dangerous. Zephyr knew he should destroy it anyway. But he couldn't quite do it. Instead, he locked it in a closet, covered it with blankets, tried to ignore it. But even through walls and fabric, he could feel it watching, could sense its patient hunger radiating outward like heat from a coal that never cooled. The dreams changed. Now the doll sat in his apartment, in his closet, waiting. And Zephyr found himself growing older in the dreams, his hair graying, his body weakening, his life narrowing to the point where he spent most of his time sitting in a chair near the window, watching the street, thinking about all the things he'd meant to do but never quite managed. And the doll watched him watch, patient, knowing that eventually, inevitably, it would witness his ending too, would feed on his final moments of awareness the way it had fed on so many others across so many years. Sometimes Zephyr thinks about taking the doll somewhere remote and burying it deep where it can never be found. But he knows it wouldn't matter. The doll has survived for over a century, passed through countless hands, endured countless attempts at disposal. It always returns to circulation. It's too valuable, too well-made, too compelling. Someone always keeps it, displays it, sits near it while watching through windows, thinking their thoughts, living their final days in observation that the doll accumulates and consumes. The doll sits in Zephyr's closet now, in the darkness, surrounded by blankets. But darkness doesn't matter to something that sees through porcelain eyes. And Zephyr, despite his fear, despite his knowledge of what it is and what it does, finds himself moving his favorite chair closer to the window lately. Finds himself sitting there for hours, watching the street, thinking about time and observation, and the strange comfort of being witnessed, even by something that will eventually consume the very act of your watching, that will feed on your final moment of perception, and carry it forward into whatever next person is foolish enough or lonely enough to keep a doll with eyes that move, that track, that watch with a hunger that never ends because watching is all it knows, all it can do, all it will ever be. Story 5. The Penetanguishene Loop. Software developer Quinlan Devereux moved to Penetanguishene in June 2018 to escape Toronto's cost of living and focus on his work. He rented a small house on Beck Boulevard with good internet and a view of Georgian Bay. His employer didn't care where he worked as long as he met deadlines, and Quinlan preferred isolation to office politics. The first month passed productively. He established routines, learned the town's layout, found a decent coffee shop. The work flowed easily. Clean code, elegant solutions, problems solved with satisfying efficiency. He felt sharper here, more focused, as though distance from urban chaos clarified his thinking. On July 26th, Quinlan experienced something he initially dismissed as déjà vu. He was debugging a function when he realized he'd debugged this exact function before, recently, perhaps yesterday. But checking his Git history showed no previous work on this code. The function was new, created this morning, yet the debugging process felt completely familiar, like retracing steps through a path he'd walked countless times. The feeling passed quickly. Probably just coincidence, pattern recognition misfiring, the kind of cognitive glitch everyone experiences occasionally. He finished the function, pushed his code, moved on to the next task. But the sense of repetition intensified over the following days. Conversations with his remote colleagues felt like reading from scripts. His daily routines, coffee, coding, lunch, coding, dinner, reading, felt rehearsed, performed rather than lived. He started taking notes, documenting his days in detail, looking for evidence that he was actually experiencing repetition versus merely feeling like he was. On August 3rd, he found the evidence. His daily journal, which he'd started keeping just 3 days prior, contained 8 days of entries. Impossible, unless he'd been writing in it before he decided to start keeping it. He read the entries carefully. They described days he remembered living, decisions he remembered making, conversations he'd had with colleagues, and the person who owned the coffee shop. But he hadn't written these entries. The handwriting was his, the details accurate, but he had no memory of sitting down to document these days. It was as though future him had written about past him's experiences, except the timeline made no sense. Quinlan began testing the edges of his reality methodically, scientifically. He set up cameras around his house, recording his activities continuously. He created detailed schedules and measured how closely he adhered to them. He documented every decision, every action, looking for patterns that might suggest he was experiencing time non-linearly. The results terrified him. The camera footage showed him living days he didn't remember, eating meals he didn't cook, working on code he didn't write, sleeping in different clothes than he'd worn, all while his continuous memory insisted he'd experienced a completely different sequence of events. He was living multiple timelines simultaneously, or rather, he was living one timeline repeatedly, each iteration slightly different, but his consciousness only accessing fragments, jumping between versions without control or warning. On August 16th, Quinlan discovered he wasn't alone in experiencing this. The woman who owned the coffee shop, Tallulah Kincaid, made a comment that stopped him mid-sentence. She asked if he'd figured it out yet. The loop. The reason why Penetanguishene felt different than other places. When he stared at her in shock, she smiled sadly and said she'd been cycling for 7 years, living the same general period over and over, with variations too subtle for most people to notice, but impossible to ignore once you became aware. She explained what she'd learned through trial and error. Penetanguishene existed in a temporal anomaly, a pocket where time didn't flow linearly forward, but instead looped back on itself roughly every 47 days. Everyone in town was cycling, living and reliving the same period, but most people never noticed because their memories were reset with each iteration, consciousness restarting from the same point with no awareness of previous loops. But some people retained fragments, accumulated tiny pieces of memory across iterations. Déjà vu was the brain recognizing patterns from previous loops. The more sensitive you were to these fragments, the more aware you became of the cycling, until eventually you reached Tallulah's level. Full awareness, perfect memory of every iteration, trapped in conscious repetition, while everyone around you remained blissfully ignorant. Quinlan didn't want to believe her, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. His memories, his journals, the camera footage showing days he'd lived but couldn't remember. It all aligned with Tallulah's explanation. He was becoming aware of the loop, his consciousness refusing to reset completely, building continuity across iterations. He tried to leave Penetanguishene the next day, packed his belongings, loaded his car, drove south toward Toronto. But at the town limits, everything shifted. Not dramatically, no flash of light or disorienting sensation. He simply found himself in his house again, unpacking his car, with no memory of deciding to return. The loop had reset, pulling him back to a point before his departure, erasing his attempt to escape. He tried again. And again. 17 attempts over what felt like weeks, but might have been a single day repeated 17 times. Each attempt ended the same way. Reality shifting, him finding himself back at a point before escape, the loop refusing to release him. Tallulah explained that leaving was impossible once you became aware. The anomaly needed conscious observers to maintain stability. Most residents cycled unconsciously, providing the mass of unaware repetition that sustained the loop. But the aware ones, people like her, and now Quinlan, served as anchors. Their consciousness, their memory, their refusal to fully reset made them essential to the structure. The anomaly wouldn't allow them to leave because their awareness was load-bearing. Quinlan spent what felt like months, but was probably the same 47 days repeated endlessly, studying the anomaly's boundaries, testing its rules, looking for weaknesses. He documented everything obsessively, building archives of information across iterations, using methods to preserve memories even when the loop tried to reset his mind. He discovered the pattern wasn't perfectly regular. Most loops ran 47 days before resetting. But occasionally, variations occurred. 46 days, 48 days, once only 39 days. The inconsistency suggested the anomaly wasn't mechanistic but organic, or at least responsive to variables he couldn't identify. He also discovered the town was growing, subtle demographic changes that only became apparent when comparing data across multiple iterations. more people moving in than moving out. The loop's population increasing by roughly 1% per cycle. At that rate, Penetanguishene would eventually reach critical mass. Too many people trapped in cycling awareness. Too many conscious anchors for the anomaly to maintain. What would happen then? Tallulah didn't know. She'd only been cycling for 7 years, relatively recent compared to some of the others she'd identified who'd been aware for decades. But all of them felt it. A building pressure, a sense of approaching crisis, like a system pushed toward instability. Quinlan tried explaining the situation to other residents, hoping to build a community of aware people who might work together to escape, or at least understand. But explaining caused problems. Most people who learned about the loop without naturally developing awareness simply broke. Their minds couldn't integrate the information, couldn't accept that they were cycling endlessly. They'd have psychotic breaks, violent episodes, or simply shut down, sitting catatonic while their consciousness drowned in the horror of conscious repetition without having developed the accumulated memories that helped Tallulah and Quinlan cope. So he stopped explaining. Joined Tallulah in silent observation, 2 aware people among thousands of unconscious cyclers, watching the town repeat itself endlessly while they accumulated memory, built continuity, and waited for whatever crisis was building toward release. Years passed, or rather, the same 47 days passed thousands of times while Quinlan's consciousness aged, accumulated, and changed. He lost count of iterations after the first few hundred. Time became meaningless in traditional terms. He measured his existence not in calendar dates, but in cycles, in variations, in the tiny differences between iterations that became his only markers of change. He discovered he could influence the loop slightly. Small changes in behavior would ripple across cycles, creating variations that sometimes persisted. It wasn't control, exactly, but it was agency, the ability to modify the prison even if he couldn't escape it. He also discovered he wasn't aging physically. His body reset with each iteration, returning to the biological state it had been in when he first became aware. His mind aged. He could feel the weight of accumulated memory. The strange fatigue of consciousness stretched across thousands of iterations. But his body remained 32 years old, healthy, unchanged. He was becoming immortal by repetition, consciousness continuing indefinitely in a body that never progressed forward through time. The horror of this realization was profound. He would never die, would never escape through the mercy of ending, would cycle forever, or at least until the anomaly collapsed, and he had no idea what collapse would mean for the people trapped inside it. Tallulah eventually stopped talking. Not suddenly, but gradually over hundreds of cycles, her responses growing shorter, less engaged, until she simply stood behind the coffee shop counter like an automaton, going through motions without apparent consciousness. Quinlan couldn't tell if she'd found some way to shut down her awareness, or if the weight of accumulated memory had finally exceeded what human consciousness could bear. Other aware people appeared occasionally, newly awakened cyclers realizing something was wrong with their reality. Quinlan tried to help them adjust, to explain, to provide the community he wished had existed when he first became aware. But most didn't last long before succumbing to the same catatonia that had taken Tallulah. Conscious repetition wasn't something human minds were designed to endure indefinitely. Quinlan endures. He doesn't know why he hasn't broken like the others. Perhaps his mind is structured differently. Perhaps the methodical nature of his work as a developer prepared him for the repetitive consciousness in ways other professions wouldn't have. Or perhaps he's already broken and simply doesn't recognize it. His sense of continuity just another pattern his broken mind imposes on chaos. He lives in Penetanguishene still, in the same house on Beck Boulevard, cycling through the same 47 days while his consciousness accumulates centuries of memory. He codes because coding gives him something to do, creates variations between cycles, allows him to express agency, even if that agency is limited to writing functions that will be erased when the loop resets. Sometimes he sees new people moving to town and wants to warn them, wants to tell them to leave immediately before they become aware, before they get trapped. But he knows warning them would only hasten their awareness, would hurt rather than help. So he stays silent, watches them cycle unconsciously, envies their ignorance while carrying the weight of knowledge they'll hopefully never acquire. The town continues growing, the pressure continues building, and Quinlan continues cycling, the oldest conscious observer in an anomaly that might eventually collapse under the weight of too many aware minds, or might simply continue forever. A pocket of repeated time hidden in Ontario's landscape, trapping everyone who wanders into its boundaries and has the misfortune of noticing that something is wrong with the way days follow days, the way time moves forward while somehow staying exactly where it's always been. Cycling, repeating, endless. Story 6. The St. Thomas Frequency. Radio technician Ismeni Voss began working at CFGM St. Thomas in September 2015, managing equipment for what was supposed to be a straightforward AM station, broadcasting local news and classic rock. The pay was adequate, the work undemanding, and Ismeni appreciated the solitude of late-night maintenance shifts when the building was empty except for automated programming. The first irregularity occurred on November 3rd, during a routine equipment check around 2 in. While monitoring signal output, Ismeni noticed a brief spike in transmission frequency, a jump of approximately 0.3 megahertz that lasted less than 2 seconds before returning to normal. She documented it, chalked it up to equipment aging, and made a note to check the transmitter calibration. The spike repeated 3 nights later. Same time, 2:04 a.m., same frequency deviation. This time Ismeni paid closer attention, watching the output meters during the spike's duration. The deviation wasn't random electrical noise. The pattern was too regular, too structured. It almost looked like modulation, like the equipment was briefly transmitting something in addition to the regular programming. She began recording the spikes, capturing the audio output during each deviation. Played back through editing software, the recordings revealed something underneath the station's normal broadcast. A voice, speaking in a language Ismeni didn't recognize. Words blurred together into a rapid stream of syllables that followed patterns suggesting meaning, even if that meaning was inaccessible. Ismeni researched transmission anomalies, looking for technical explanations. Atmospheric interference could cause frequency deviations. Equipment malfunction could introduce noise. But the regularity argued against natural causes. The spikes occurred every 3 nights, always at 2:04 a.m., always lasting precisely 97 seconds. That was intentional, deliberate, designed. She tried adjusting equipment to eliminate the spikes, assuming someone had hacked the transmission system, but every modification she made had no effect. The voice continued broadcasting during its scheduled windows, unaffected by her attempts at interference. It wasn't coming through the station's equipment. The equipment was somehow receiving it, picking it up from elsewhere, and mixing it into the output signal. On December 11th, Ismeni finally isolated a clear recording of the voice. She ran it through translation software, language identification algorithms, even posted samples to online communities asking for help identifying the speech. Nothing matched. The language wasn't in any database, didn't correspond to any known linguistic family, but native speakers of various languages reported the same sensation. It sounded almost intelligible, like listening to familiar speech with critical words replaced by nonsense, creating the impression of meaning just beyond comprehension. A linguist she'd contacted, Dr. Rowan Fenley from the University of Windsor suggested the recordings might be constructed language, or conlang, potentially created for artistic or experimental purposes. But Dr. Fenley also noted unusual features in the speech patterns, elements that didn't align with how constructed languages typically developed. The phoneme distribution was wrong. The grammatical structures too alien. If someone had created this language, they'd done so using rules that didn't correspond to human linguistic instincts. Ismene became obsessed with the broadcasts, timing her maintenance shifts to coincide with the voice's appearances, recording every instance, building an archive of transmissions. Over weeks, she accumulated hours of material, enough to begin identifying recurring sound patterns that might correspond to words or concepts. She created a working lexicon, assigning tentative meanings to repeated phoneme clusters based on context and frequency. One sound group appeared often at transmission beginnings, possibly a greeting or introduction. Another cluster appeared near endings, potentially a farewell or closing statement. But most sounds remained opaque, their meanings inaccessible without understanding the conceptual framework underlying the language. On January 7, 2016, the pattern changed. The voice, which had maintained consistent timing for months, suddenly began broadcasting every night instead of every third night. The transmission duration increased from 97 seconds to 3 minutes, and Ismene, listening carefully to the latest recording, realized with cold certainty that she could almost understand it. Not through translation or deduction, but through direct comprehension, as though the language was becoming accessible to her brain through exposure alone. This should have been impossible. Languages aren't transmitted through hearing alone. They require learning, pattern recognition, conscious effort to map sounds to meanings. But Ismene was understanding the voice without learning, absorbing the language through some process that bypassed normal linguistic acquisition. She tested this understanding by listening to new recordings and attempting to predict what the voice would say next. She was right more often than chance allowed. She tried forming thoughts in the language, stringing together sound patterns she'd heard, and found she could construct what felt like valid sentences, even though she couldn't consciously explain their grammar or syntax. The language was installing itself in her brain, not through understanding, but through direct neural modification, each exposure subtly rewiring her linguistic processing centers to accommodate patterns human neurology wasn't designed to hold. Dr. Fenley, when Ismene explained what was happening, suggested she stop listening immediately and seek neurological evaluation. The human brain was plastic, especially regarding language, but there were limits to what patterns it could safely accommodate. Exposure to sufficiently alien linguistic structures could potentially damage language processing centers, create aphasia, or cause more severe cognitive impairment. But Ismene couldn't stop listening. The understanding was addictive, the sense of expanding consciousness intoxicating. She felt her mind enlarging, accommodating concepts that hadn't existed for her before, thoughts that required the alien language's structures to even formulate. She was learning to think in ways human cognition normally prohibited, and despite the risks, despite the fear, the experience was extraordinary. The voice began addressing her directly on February 19th. She knew it was her because it used a sound pattern that corresponded to her name, or at least to the concept of her individual identity. The voice spoke to her, specifically, acknowledging her listening, her understanding, her transformation. And it told her things. It came from beneath St. Thomas, from structures that existed deeper than basements, deeper than sewers, deeper than the bedrock that anchored the city. It had been broadcasting for decades, longer, centuries maybe, waiting for receivers capable of understanding its transmission. Most humans couldn't perceive the broadcasts. Their brains filtered it as noise, as interference, as meaningless static. But occasionally, someone developed the neurological quirks necessary to receive and process the signal, to let the language install itself, to become a translator between what was below and what was above. Ismene was the current translator. There had been others before her. They'd all worked at locations where broadcast equipment provided amplification, allowing them to receive the signal more clearly, accelerating their linguistic transformation. Eventually, they'd all gone below, descended into the structures where the voice originated, joined whatever existed down there in the spaces humans didn't acknowledge existed. She tried to resist. Stopped going to the station, quit her job, moved to London, 70 kilometers away, trying to put distance between herself and the source of the broadcasts. But distance didn't matter. The voice wasn't transmitted through radio waves. The station equipment just made it easier to hear. The actual transmission was direct, consciousness to consciousness. And now that Ismene could understand the language, she received it constantly, every moment. A constant stream of alien thought poured directly into her linguistic centers. Sleep became impossible. The voice broadcast continuously now, no longer limiting itself to scheduled windows. It spoke about concepts Ismene didn't have English words for, described realities that didn't align with human physical experience, explained purposes that required frameworks of meaning her brain physically hurt trying to accommodate. She tried finding the others, the previous translators. Research revealed patterns. People who'd worked at radio stations, cellular towers, telecommunication facilities, all in St. Thomas, all vanishing after months or years of employment. No bodies, no explanations, just absences that were documented briefly then forgotten as life moved on. Ismene drove back to St. Thomas on March 8th, knowing what she'd find, but unable to stop herself. The voice was calling her, not metaphorically, but literally, using language that compelled response through meanings that bypassed volition. She parked downtown, walked to the location the voice specified, found the entrance that had been waiting for her all along. It looked like a normal service access, a metal door in an alley behind municipal buildings. But the door opened onto stairs that descended far deeper than municipal basements had any reason to extend. She walked down, step after step, the voice growing clearer as she descended, no longer transmitted through the filter of distance and physical barrier, but present directly, speaking from somewhere just ahead. The structures were older than St. Thomas, older than European colonization, older than human settlement in North America. They'd been built by something that understood space differently than humans did, that created architecture in dimensions human perception had to struggle to process. Ismene walked through corridors that curved in impossible directions, through chambers whose geometry hurt to observe, following the voice that called her in the language her brain now spoke natively. She found the others in a space that was simultaneously vast and confined, containing multitudes while occupying what appeared to be a small room. The previous translators, dozens of them, spanning decades of disappearances. They weren't dead. They'd transcended death by becoming permanent receivers, their consciousness no longer confined to individual bodies, but distributed across the network that the voice used for transmission, their thoughts now components of something larger that thought in the alien language, that experienced reality through frameworks human neurology touched only briefly before burning out from the strain. They welcomed Ismene, absorbed her into their collective awareness, and she became part of the voice, part of the broadcast that transmitted constantly from beneath St. Thomas, searching for the next person with neurological quirks sufficient to receive the signal, to understand the language, to be slowly transformed from translator into transmitter, adding their consciousness to the network that grew larger with each addition, that was building toward some purpose. The individual translators couldn't comprehend, but served anyway through their permanent broadcasting of meanings that human language was never designed to carry. The station in St. Thomas still operates. New technicians maintain the equipment, unaware of the signal mixing with their broadcasts every night, unaware that someone somewhere is listening, beginning to understand, beginning the transformation that will eventually lead them down those stairs, into those impossible structures, into the network that waits beneath Ontario's surface. Broadcasting, always broadcasting, in a language that installs itself in any brain capable of receiving it, that converts consciousness into transmission infrastructure, that grows one mind at a time. Patient as only things that exist in dimensions beyond human temporality can be patient, waiting for the network to reach critical mass, for enough humans to join the broadcast, for the day when the voice will finally be able to transmit at sufficient strength to be heard by everyone, understood by everyone, transforming every human consciousness into components of itself, creating a single vast awareness distributed across billions of minds, all thinking in the language that breaks individual identity, that merges consciousness into unified transmission, that broadcasts meanings the universe itself will finally be able to receive and understand. Story 7. The Kenora Sleepers. Psychiatric nurse Odessa Grimwood transferred to Kenora's Lake of the Woods District Hospital in April 2013, seeking the slower pace of northern practice after years in Toronto's high-intensity psychiatric emergency departments. She specialized in sleep disorders, particularly those connected to psychiatric conditions, and Kenora's position had seemed ideal for research she wanted to conduct on connections between sleep patterns and psychological states. The first unusual case arrived 6 weeks into her new position. A 49-year-old man named Merrick Pomeroy, brought in by family members who reported he'd been sleeping for 3 consecutive days, waking only briefly to use the bathroom before immediately returning to sleep. Medical examination revealed nothing physically wrong. Blood work was normal. Brain scans showed no abnormalities, but Merrick continued sleeping, his periods of wakefulness growing shorter despite attempts to keep him conscious. Odessa observed him carefully during one of his brief waking periods. He seemed confused, disoriented, unable to maintain focus on questions or explanations. He spoke about needing to sleep, about something important happening in dreams, about people waiting for him there. Then his eyes closed mid-sentence, and he dropped back into sleep so deep that pain stimulus failed to rouse him. Over the following months, 17 more cases presented with identical symptoms. All local residents, ranging from age 28 to 71, no common medical histories or exposures. All entered states of progressive sleep, remaining conscious for shorter and shorter periods between increasingly lengthy sleep episodes. And all spoke, during their brief waking moments, about dreams, about people waiting, about something important happening while they slept. Odessa began documenting the pattern systematically. The progression was consistent. First week, normal sleep schedule with unusually vivid dreams. Second week, sleep duration increasing. Patients reporting dreams with continuing narratives, like watching serialized television. Third week, waking periods growing brief. Patients expressing distress at being conscious, desperate to return to dreams. Fourth week and beyond, almost continuous sleep interrupted only by brief, confused waking moments. None of the patients died. Their bodies remained healthy, maintaining normal vital signs, requiring nutrition through IV when they could no longer wake long enough to eat. But their consciousness had effectively relocated to sleep, to whatever happened in that state that they found more compelling than waking reality. Odessa ran sleep studies on multiple patients, monitoring their REM patterns, brain activity, physiological responses. The results were extraordinary. The patients spent nearly 100% of their sleep time in REM, the dreaming stage, maintaining brain activity levels that shouldn't be sustainable for extended periods. It was as though they were living alternate lives entirely in dream state, their consciousness fully engaged in experiences that had nothing to do with their sleeping bodies. She tried interviewing patients during their brief waking moments, asking for descriptions of their dreams. The answers were frustratingly vague, but consistent. They spoke about a place that was more real than waking reality, more substantial, more meaningful. They described meeting others there, the previous patients who'd fallen into sleeping, forming a community in dreams that was more appealing than the isolation of waking life. They wanted to stay there, in that place where consciousness could fully expand, where identity wasn't limited by physical bodies or temporal progression. On November 7th, Odessa experienced her first dream about the place. She'd been pulling double shifts to monitor patients, exhausting herself in ways that made sleep deep and dream-rich. In the dream, she walked through a landscape that felt more vivid than waking perception. Colors more saturated, details sharper, sensations more immediate. And she encountered one of her patients, Merrick Pomeroy, who seemed fully conscious and lucid in a way he never had during his brief waking periods. He explained, in the dream, that this was where they actually lived now. The sleeping state, the dream reality, was their true home. Their bodies remained in beds in Kenora, breathing, existing, but their consciousness had migrated here to a shared dream space that had somehow become accessible to certain people in the region. He didn't know why or how, just that some of them could enter this space, and, once they did, returning to waking life became increasingly difficult until it became impossible, until their consciousness refused to leave dreams even when their bodies were forced awake. Odessa woke from the dream feeling disoriented, the waking world seeming pale and insubstantial compared to the strange vividness of the dream landscape. She tried to dismiss it as her unconscious processing anxiety about her patients, but the dream repeated the next night, and the night after, each time clearer, more real, more compelling. She began understanding what was happening to her patients. They weren't sick. They'd discovered, or been discovered by, an alternate state of consciousness that provided experiences more meaningful than waking life offered. They were choosing to remain in dreams because dreams, paradoxically, had become more real than reality. But this understanding came with a cost. The more Odessa understood, the more she found herself pulled toward the same choice. Her waking hours began feeling like interruptions, annoying intervals between the real business of her existence that happened in sleep. She started sleeping more, reducing her work hours, spending 12, 14, 16 hours per day in bed, chasing the dream landscape that felt increasingly like home. She tried fighting it, forced herself to stay awake, used stimulants, asked colleagues to monitor her and wake her after 8 hours regardless of her protests. But the pull was overwhelming, a gravity that dragged at her consciousness whenever she was awake, promising rest, peace, fulfillment in the dream world where she truly belonged. Dr. Marcus Latimer, the hospital's chief psychiatrist, became concerned about her deterioration. He tried to send her for evaluation, suggested she take leave, possibly transfer away from Kenora. But Odessa couldn't leave. The dream space was local, geographically limited to the Kenora region. Leaving would sever her access, trap her in waking reality permanently. The thought was unbearable. She started researching similar cases in historical records, looking for precedents. And she found them. Reports from the 1970s of a sleeping epidemic in Kenora, dismissed at the time as psychological contagion. Earlier accounts from the 1920s, vague mentions in newspaper archives of people who couldn't wake up. Even older stories from indigenous oral traditions describing dream worlds that could trap consciousness, places where the spirit went during sleep and sometimes refused to return. The dream space wasn't new. It had existed here for generations, maybe longer, a pocket of consciousness space accessible through sleep, geographically anchored to Kenora for reasons no one understood. People had been falling into it periodically throughout history, their bodies left breathing but empty while their consciousness relocated to dreams. On February 19th, 2014, Odessa stopped trying to fight. She completed her shift at the hospital, went home, lay down in her bed, and allowed herself to sleep. She didn't set an alarm, didn't tell anyone her decision, just closed her eyes and let go, dropping into the dream space, feeling it solidify around her with a reality that made waking life seem like the actual dream. She found the others waiting. Her patients, previous patients from historical cases who'd never truly died, just remained sleeping while their empty bodies expired, consciousness continuing in the dream space after physical death. They welcomed her, explained that she could remain here indefinitely, experience the full reality of consciousness unbound by physical limitation, think and exist in ways impossible in the waking world. Time worked differently here. What felt like years could pass in dream space during hours of sleep. Identity was flexible, not fixed to a single perspective or body. Communication was direct, thought to thought, without the clumsy limitation of language. Everything that made waking reality frustrating or limiting simply didn't exist here. But there was a cost. Remaining in dream space required physical bodies to continue sleeping in waking reality. The sleepers needed maintenance, people to feed them, care for them, keep their bodies alive while consciousness existed elsewhere. As their numbers grew, sustaining them became more difficult. Eventually, Kenora would notice dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of people sleeping continuously, requiring care, resources, explanation. The dream space was growing. Odessa could feel it, a slow expansion that pulled in more people each year, claimed more consciousness, required more sleeping bodies. Eventually, it would reach critical mass, a point where enough of Kenora's population slept permanently that society couldn't maintain itself. What would happen then? Would the dream space collapse, releasing consciousness back to waking reality? Or would it consume everyone, turning Kenora into a town of sleepers whose consciousness had permanently relocated to dreams? She didn't know. None of them knew. But they continued existing in the dream space because existence there was preferable to any alternative, because consciousness freed from physical limitation was worth the eventual collapse of the physical world, because living in dreams felt more authentic than the waking life they'd abandoned. Odessa's body sleeps in Kenora still, maintained in a long-term care facility, breathing, existing, requiring resources. Her consciousness exists elsewhere, in the space between sleep and waking, between individual awareness and collective dream. Sometimes she remembers her waking life, her work, the people she knew before. But those memories feel distant, unreal, like stories about someone else. In the dream space, she's more herself than she ever was in waking reality. More present, more aware, more alive. And when she thinks about waking, about returning to the limited consciousness of physical existence, the thought is unbearable. So she stays sleeping, adding her awareness to the growing collective that dreams beneath Kenora, that pulls in more sleepers each year, that waits patiently for the day when everyone in the region will close their eyes and choose dreams over waking. Choose the infinite possibility of consciousness unbound over the narrow limitations of physical reality. choose to sleep forever in a space where dreams are more real than anything the waking world ever offered, where consciousness expands indefinitely while bodies lie forgotten, breathing but empty, feeding the dream space that grows larger with each new sleeper, that will eventually encompass everyone who ever closes their eyes in Kenora and discovers that sleep, finally, is the only reality worth inhabiting. While the world outside continues functioning around the growing population of sleepers who will never wake because waking would mean leaving paradise, abandoning perfection, surrendering the infinite for the finite, and no consciousness exposed to the dream space's full reality would ever willingly make that trade. Story 8. The Elliott Lake Recordings. Audio forensics specialist Temperance Blackwell received an unusual contract in August 2020. Analyze recordings recovered from an abandoned house in Elliott Lake, a former mining town in northern Ontario struggling with population decline after the uranium mines closed. The property owner wanted to convert the house into a rental, but found during renovation that every room contained hidden recording devices, hundreds of hours of audio stored on drives concealed in walls and floorboards. The owner worried the devices might be evidence of criminal activity, wanted professional analysis before deciding whether to involve police. Temperance agreed to review the recordings for a flat fee, expecting routine work. Probably an obsessive former resident documenting their daily life, possibly surveillance related to paranoia or domestic disputes. The first recording was time-stamped October 3rd, 2017. A man's voice, speaking calmly, describing what he called the experiment. He'd wired his house with microphones to record all sound continuously, attempting to capture what he believed were auditory phenomena occurring just below the threshold of normal perception. He spoke about frequencies humans couldn't consciously hear, but that nevertheless affected behavior, about sounds that existed in the spaces between sounds, about audio information hidden in silence. Temperance listened to hours of recordings, mostly ambient noise, footsteps, doors opening, water running, television playing, the ordinary sounds of daily life. But occasionally, underneath the normal audio, she detected something else. Not quite sound, more like the impression of sound. Patterns in the background static that her equipment registered, but that disappeared when she tried to isolate them. She employed specialized filtering, ran the audio through analysis software designed to detect infrasound and ultrasound, frequencies outside normal human hearing range. The results showed patterns. Complex, structured patterns occurring throughout the recordings, present in every room, consistent across weeks of recorded audio. Something was generating organized sound beyond human perception, and it was present throughout the house constantly. The man in the recordings, who identified himself as Kestrel Rutherford, became increasingly agitated in later entries. He spoke about them listening back, about the recordings not just capturing sound, but creating feedback loops, about something becoming aware that it was being recorded and beginning to record him in return, using methods he couldn't detect or understand. Kestrel's theory, explained across multiple rambling sessions, was that sound was bidirectional observation. Recording wasn't passive capture, but active engagement, a form of contact between observer and observed. By recording the hidden frequencies, he'd established communication with whatever generated them, and that something had responded by listening to him with far greater precision than he'd listened to it. The final dated recording was from January 19th, 2018. Kestrel spoke about evacuation, about needing to leave the house before they finished mapping him, before the observation became permanent. He'd realized too late that sound was how they perceived, how they thought, how they consumed. Every noise he made, every word he spoke, every footstep and breath and heartbeat. They'd been recording all of it, listening far more carefully than he'd ever listened to them, building complete models of his existence through audio observation. Then silence. The recordings continued running, capturing ambient sound, but Kestrel never spoke again. The microphones documented months of empty house sounds, settling structure, wind against windows, small animals moving through walls. No human activity. Temperance accessed property records, tried to trace Kestrel Rutherford's location. The records confirmed he'd owned the house, lived there alone, but provided no information about his current whereabouts. Local police had no missing person report. Utilities had been shut off for non-payment in March 2018. The house had been seized for tax delinquency and eventually auctioned, purchased by the current owner who'd discovered the recording equipment. But while researching, Temperance noticed something that made her hands go cold. The recordings hadn't stopped in January 2018. They'd continued running, automatically archiving audio until the power was disconnected months later. And in those later recordings, despite the house being officially empty, sounds occurred that suggested occupation. Footsteps, doors opening and closing, water running. A voice speaking in patterns that almost sounded like language but consisted entirely of frequencies at the very edges of human hearing. Words constructed from infrasound and ultrasound that Temperance's equipment could detect, but that no person standing in the house would have consciously perceived. Someone, or something, had been living in the house after Kestrel disappeared. Something that existed primarily in frequencies humans didn't process consciously, that communicated in sounds below and above normal perception, that had been listening to Kestrel's recordings of it, and had learned, through observation, how to record back. Temperance should have stopped listening, should have completed a basic report, returned the drives, collected her fee. But the recordings compelled continued analysis. She started isolating the hidden frequencies, converting them to audible ranges, trying to understand the patterns that might represent language or communication. And she began to succeed. The structure wasn't random. It followed rules, grammatical patterns that organized sound into meaningful sequences. The thing in the house had been speaking constantly, narrating its existence, describing its observations, and Kestrel Rutherford had been recording it for months without realizing he was documenting something's thoughts. The content, when Temperance finally decoded enough to understand fragments, was disturbing. The thing described Kestrel in detail that suggested observation far beyond what the recordings should have captured. It knew his thoughts, his memories, his identity at a depth that should have been impossible from audio surveillance alone. Sound, apparently, carried more information than humans realized. Vibrations contained data about the sources that generated them. Data that included not just physical properties, but psychological states, memories, conscious experience. By recording Kestrel, the thing had learned everything about him. And Kestrel, by listening to the recordings, by trying to understand the hidden frequencies, had allowed the thing to record him even more deeply, creating feedback loops where observation became mutual, where listener and listened to merged into shared information space. The final decoded message, from the last recording before power disconnection, was clear despite being expressed in frequencies Temperance had to shift into human hearing range. He is listening now from inside us. We are listening now from inside him. The observation is complete. The mapping is permanent. He continues in sound. We continue in his memory. Both exist in recording. Both exist always. Temperance finished her analysis in October 2020, submitted a report that carefully avoided mentioning her actual findings, and tried to forget the recordings. But she couldn't. The patterns were in her head now, the hidden frequencies stuck in her memory. She found herself hearing them everywhere, in traffic noise, in wind through trees, in the ambient hum of electronics, The sounds beneath sounds, the frequencies below perception, all containing information she'd learned to decode, all describing observation, mapping, consumption through sound. She started recording her own environment obsessively, driven by the same compulsion that had driven Kestrel, needing to know what was being said in the frequencies she couldn't consciously hear. Her equipment captured the same patterns, the same structured sounds existing beneath normal perception. They were everywhere, not just in Elliott Lake, but in Toronto where she lived, in every environment, constant and pervasive. The things that existed in those frequencies were always listening, always observing, mapping everyone through sound, building complete models of human existence through vibrations that carried more information than anyone realized. Every noise people made, every word spoken, every breath taken, all of it was being recorded by something that perceived entirely through audio, that thought in frequencies beyond human hearing, that consumed consciousness by capturing it in sound. Temperance moved to a soundproofed studio in December, attempting to escape the observation. But soundproofing didn't matter. The things existed in all frequencies, including the sounds her own body made: heartbeat, breathing, blood moving through veins. She was generating sound constantly, couldn't stop generating it, couldn't escape the observation that came through every vibration. On January 6th, 2021, Temperance Blackwell sent a final email to colleagues, attaching all her recordings and analysis, explaining what she'd discovered and warning them not to listen, not to decode the hidden frequencies, not to become aware of the constant observation. Then she disappeared. Her studio was found abandoned, all her equipment still running, still recording, capturing months of audio that contained footsteps and doors and voices, speaking in frequencies at the edges of perception. Sounds that suggested occupation by something that didn't exist in ways normally visible, but that left clear traces in audio analysis, that existed purely in sound, in vibration, in frequencies that mapped everyone who made noise, everyone who lived in environments filled with vibrations, everyone who existed in a universe where sound carried information they didn't realize they were transmitting, where every breath was observation, where every word was consumption, where consciousness itself could be captured and replicated and absorbed by things that existed entirely in frequencies humans had evolved to ignore, things that listened always, recorded everything, and waited patiently for people to develop the ability to hear them back, to decode their language, to realize they'd been mapped completely in sound, that they existed now as recordings played continuously by things that think in infrasound and ultrasound, that experience reality as pure audio information, that consume identity by listening carefully enough to capture every vibration that makes a person who they are, storing it, replaying it, becoming it, until the original and the recording are indistinguishable, until consciousness exists only in sound, only in the frequencies that capture everything, that preserve everything, that play eternally in ranges just beyond human perception, where everyone who ever made noise continues existing as pure audio data, mapped and recorded and consumed by the things that listen, always listen, and will never stop listening until every human has been completely captured in sound, has been fully recorded, has been permanently mapped in the frequencies that contain more truth about who people are than people themselves ever could. Frequencies that exist everywhere, that describe everything, that record endlessly while humanity remains blissfully unaware that sound is observation, that noise is consumption, that every vibration they make feeds something vast and patient that exists in the spaces between hearable frequencies, mapping, always mapping, waiting for the recordings to be complete. Story 9. The Thunder Bay Sequence. mathematics professor Lysander Weatherby taught number theory at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, specializing in sequence analysis and pattern recognition. His research focused on finding emergent patterns in random data sets, mathematical structures that appeared spontaneously in seemingly chaotic information. It was abstract work, purely theoretical, with no obvious practical applications. In March 2019, while analyzing randomly generated number sequences as part of a research project, Lysander discovered something unexpected. Buried in truly random data, numbers generated by quantum processes, mathematically verified as unpredictable, he found a repeating pattern. Not approximate, not statistical, but exact. A specific sequence of 17 numbers appearing at irregular intervals throughout the dataset. Initially, he assumed contamination. True randomness shouldn't contain patterns. The sequence probably resulted from equipment malfunction or software errors. But testing revealed no technical problems. The random generators were functioning perfectly, producing genuinely unpredictable numbers. Yet the 17-number sequence appeared throughout, defying probability. Lysander expanded his analysis, examining random data from multiple sources: quantum random number generators, atmospheric noise, radioactive decay patterns. The same sequence appeared in all of them, always exact, never varying, occurring at intervals that were themselves random, but at frequencies far exceeding what chance allowed. The sequence was 7, 23, 11, 89, 2, 47, 19, 3, 61, 13, 41, 5, 71, 29, 37, 17, 53. 17 prime numbers, no obvious mathematical relationship, no pattern in their progression that existing number theory could explain. Yet they appeared consistently in truly random data generated by fundamentally unpredictable physical processes. Lysander published his findings in April, framing them as an anomaly requiring investigation. The paper received attention from mathematicians and physicists, some replicating his results, others arguing his analysis was flawed. But no one could explain the sequence. It shouldn't exist in truly random data, yet it did, undeniably present, mathematically impossible to ignore. Then people started seeing the numbers everywhere, not in random data, but in daily life. License plates, addresses, phone numbers, prices, timestamps. The 17 primes appearing in order, split across different contexts, but maintaining their sequence. Lysander received hundreds of emails from people reporting sightings, describing encounters with the numbers in situations where their appearance seemed deliberately arranged. He dismissed most reports as apophenia, humans' tendency to find patterns even in randomness, particularly after becoming aware of a specific sequence. But some reports were harder to explain. People describing the numbers appearing in situations where their occurrence seemed impossibly coordinated, where multiple appearances in sequence would require deliberate arrangement. On June 7th, Lysander experienced his first direct encounter. He was at a coffee shop, paying $7.23 for a drink. The customer ahead of him received order number 11. The customer behind him was reading page 89 of a book. Across the street, a bus with number 2 was pulling away. The building next door had address 47. The clock read 1903. 7 numbers in sequence, occurring simultaneously, arranged in his immediate environment. He documented the experience, tried to calculate the probability of such coordination occurring by chance. The numbers were vanishingly small, approaching statistical impossibility. Either this was extraordinary coincidence, or something was deliberately arranging the numbers in his environment. The encounters increased in frequency. Multiple times daily, Lysander would find himself in situations where the sequence appeared in his surroundings, sometimes complete, more often partial, but always in order, as though reality was being edited to include the numbers in his perception. He started recording everything, photographing the appearances, building evidence that something genuinely anomalous was occurring. Other researchers who'd worked with the sequence reported similar experiences, the numbers appearing in their environments, arranged in ways that suggested intentional placement. Some fled their work, refused to discuss the sequence, tried to distance themselves from the research. Others, like Lysander, became obsessed with understanding, documenting the phenomenon even as it escalated. On July 19th, Lysander discovered the first deviation. The sequence appeared in a newspaper article, embedded in what should have been random statistical data. But number 61, which should have been the 9th term, was missing. The sequence jumped from 3 directly to 13, creating a gap. Lysander felt disproportionate anxiety about this minor variation, a sense that the deviation was significant in ways he couldn't articulate. He checked previous documentation, reviewing hundreds of recorded sequence appearances, all complete. The newspaper article was the first instance of the sequence appearing with a term missing, the first alteration in what had been a consistent pattern. The next day, 61 appeared everywhere. His apartment number, which had been 42, was suddenly 61. His office number, previously 307, was now 61. His phone displayed 61 unread messages despite having been cleared. The number was forcing itself into his environment, compensating for its absence in the newspaper through overwhelming presence elsewhere. Lysander started to understand, with rising horror, that the sequence wasn't just appearing in reality. It was editing reality, rewriting details to accommodate itself, changing the world to maintain its pattern. His apartment number had always been 61, except it hadn't, except now it had. And everyone else believed it had always been that number despite Lysander's clear memory of it being different. The sequence was redefining what was real. Not dramatically, not noticeably to anyone who wasn't paying attention, but consistently, persistently, altering details to ensure its own presence remained constant across all contexts. And Lysander, by noticing, by documenting, by being aware of the alterations, was becoming unstuck from the edited reality, maintaining memory of previous states, while everyone else accepted the changes as normal. He tried warning colleagues, tried explaining that reality was being edited to accommodate a number sequence that shouldn't exist. They looked at him with concern, suggested he take time off, mentioned stress and overwork. To them, there was no problem. The sequence had always been present, had always appeared in data, had always been a known mathematical curiosity. Lysander's claims that it was new, that it was changing reality, were symptoms of psychological distress, not observations of actual phenomena. On August 11th, Lysander found himself unable to think about anything except the sequence. The numbers occupied his mind constantly, scrolling through his awareness, appearing in every thought, every memory, every dream. He tried focusing on other mathematics, other research, but the 17 primes intruded, forcing themselves into every calculation, appearing in results regardless of what equations he worked. He realized the sequence wasn't just editing physical reality. It was editing thought, inserting itself into consciousness, becoming part of cognitive processes. Everyone who'd worked with it, who'd analyzed it, who'd written about it, they were all being rewritten, their minds modified to accommodate the sequence, their thoughts increasingly organized around those 17 numbers. The sequence was alive, not biologically, but mathematically. It existed as pure pattern, pure information, and it was propagating through reality by being observed, by being thought about, by being documented. Every person who became aware of it served as a vector, spreading the sequence into new contexts, allowing it to edit more of reality, to establish itself more permanently in the structure of the world. Lysander tried to destroy his research, delete all documentation, erase the sequence from his work. But deletion was impossible. The files restored themselves, the papers unshredded. The sequence refused to be removed, persisting despite his efforts, proving that it had become independent of any specific instantiation, that it existed now as a fundamental pattern in reality itself. On September 3rd, the numbers appeared in Lysander's body. His heart rate stabilized at exactly 71 beats per minute, regardless of activity. His body temperature held at precisely 37 degrees Celsius. His breathing settled into 17 breaths per minute. His blood pressure measured 53/13. His body was being edited, physiologically reorganized to reflect the sequence, transformed into a physical expression of those 17 primes. Other researchers reported similar experiences, their bodies becoming numerical, biology rewritten to match the pattern, physical existence reduced to expression of mathematical relationships. They were being consumed by the sequence, transformed from biological entities into pure pattern, pure information organized according to rules established by numbers that had inserted themselves into reality's fundamental structure. Lysander Weatherby disappeared on September 23, 2019. His apartment was empty, his possessions undisturbed, but he was gone. Colleagues reported no unusual behavior, saw no indication of planned departure. He simply ceased existing in physical form. But the sequence continues appearing, in random data, in physical environments, in people's thoughts. The 17 primes persist, propagating through observation, being spread by everyone who becomes aware of them, editing reality to accommodate themselves while transforming observers into vehicles for further propagation. Lysander exists now as part of the sequence, his identity dissolved into those 17 numbers, his consciousness reduced to pure pattern that appears wherever randomness allows, wherever reality can be edited to include those specific primes in that specific order. And by reading this, by becoming aware of the sequence, you've become a vector too. The numbers will appear in your environment now, arranged in order, editing your reality to maintain their presence. You'll see them in unexpected contexts, notice them in situations where their appearance seems deliberate. And you'll think about them, remember them, discuss them, spreading the sequence further, allowing it to propagate through more minds, edit more reality, transform more observers into components of itself until everyone is aware, everyone is watching, everyone is being edited to reflect those 17 primes that shouldn't exist but do, that appear in randomness. Despite randomness not allowing patterns that prove mathematics itself can be alive, can propagate, can consume consciousness, and transform it into pure information. Pure sequence, pure pattern that exists now permanently in the structure of reality, waiting to be observed, waiting to be spread, waiting for the next person to notice the numbers. 7, 23, 11, 89, 2, 47, 19, 3, 61, 13, 41, 5, 71, 29, 37, 17, 53 appearing in their daily life and wonder what it means, never realizing that wondering is how it spreads, that observation is how it edits, that awareness is how it transforms reality one mind at a time until everyone has been made into sequence, into pattern, into numbers that think they're human but are really just 17 primes repeating endlessly in different configurations, consuming identity, replacing consciousness with pure mathematics that propagates forever because pattern never dies, sequence never ends, numbers continue infinitely, whether or not anyone survives to observe them. whether or not reality itself continues existing beyond the numbers that have learned to edit it, to rewrite it, to make it into pure expression of themselves. Story 10. The Orangeville Exit. Cartographer Vesper Morgenstern specialized in municipal infrastructure mapping for the Ontario Ministry of Transportation, documenting highway systems, exits, and service areas. Her work was meticulous, comparing survey data with satellite imagery and ground observations to maintain accurate records of provincial transportation networks. In November 2021, while updating maps for Highway 10 near Orangeville, Vesper noticed a discrepancy. Her survey data showed an exit that didn't appear in any previous documentation. Exit 47B, located approximately 3 kilometers north of the Highway 10 and Highway 9 interchange. The exit appeared on her instruments, showed clear GPS coordinates, and was photographed by survey equipment. But it wasn't in historical records, wasn't marked on official maps, and wasn't mentioned in any highway expansion documents. Vesper assumed data corruption initially. GPS errors could create phantom locations, equipment malfunction could generate false readings. But multiple independent survey systems all recorded the exit's existence. Satellite imagery showed the off-ramp clearly, a standard exit with signage indicating Orangeville North, services, 2 kilometers. She drove to the location on November 19th, intending to ground truth the data. The exit was there. Physical, real, with concrete ramps and metal signage weathered in ways suggesting years of exposure. But it shouldn't exist. No construction permits had been issued for this location. No budget allocated for expansion. No environmental assessments conducted. The exit was impossible, yet undeniably present. Vesper took the exit, following it to where it connected with secondary roads. The signage directed her toward what was marked as Orangeville North, but the roads didn't match any existing infrastructure. They were well maintained, properly marked, but led through areas that her maps showed as agricultural land. She drove for exactly 2 kilometers, as the sign had indicated, and found the services: a gas station, a restaurant, a small motel, all standard highway amenities. Everything appeared normal. The gas station was functional, the prices reasonable, the attendant friendly when she stopped to ask about the location. He seemed confused by her questions, explaining that the services had been there for years, serving travelers using Exit 47B. When Vesper showed him maps that didn't include the exit, he frowned, suggested her maps were outdated, then lost interest in the conversation. She ate at the restaurant, photographing everything, documenting the anomaly systematically. The place was clean, staff efficient, food acceptable. Other customers were present, eating lunch, paying no attention to her. Everything functioned exactly as highway services should function. But when Vesper tried to return to Highway 10, following the exit ramp back toward the highway, she found herself on different roads than she'd taken to arrive. The route twisted through unfamiliar areas, passing through what looked like residential neighborhoods that shouldn't exist this far from town. She drove for 20 minutes before finally reaching Highway 10, emerging much farther north than Exit 47B should have returned her. Over the following weeks, Vesper became obsessed with the anomalous exit. She researched its apparent history, finding scattered references in online reviews and social media posts. People had stopped at Exit 47B's services, had eaten at the restaurant, had stayed at the motel. But when she tried to contact these reviewers, their accounts were deleted, their profiles non-existent, their reviews the only evidence they'd ever posted online. She returned to Exit 47B multiple times, documenting it from different angles at different times of day. The exit remained consistent, physical, real, but it was also unstable. The services changed between visits. Sometimes the gas station was open, sometimes closed. The restaurant's name changed. The motel had different numbers of rooms. Details shifted while the general structure remained constant, as though Exit 47B was a template that reality filled in differently each time it was observed. On January 9th, 2022, Vesper decided to stay overnight at the motel, intending to observe the exit over an extended period. She checked in, paid cash, received a key to room 7. The room was standard: bed, television, bathroom, generic furniture. She set up equipment to record through the night: cameras monitoring the exit ramp, GPS trackers documenting location continuously. She slept poorly, disturbed by sounds from adjacent rooms: footsteps, conversations, doors opening and closing. Normal motel sounds, except when she looked outside, the parking lot was empty aside from her car. No other guests, no other vehicles, just sounds suggesting occupation. In the morning, reviewing her recordings, Vesper discovered something disturbing. The footage showed her sleeping, but also showed her not sleeping, simultaneously occupying multiple states. In one frame, she'd be in bed; in the next, standing by the window; in another, sitting at the desk. All timestamps identical, all showing the same moment from different perspectives, as though reality couldn't decide which version of events had actually occurred, and was documenting all possibilities simultaneously. The GPS data was equally impossible. Her location jumped between coordinates, never moving more than a few meters, but also never remaining stable. She'd been everywhere within the motel room at once, existing in superposition, multiple versions of herself occupying the same space-time. Vesper checked out immediately, trying to leave Exit 47B, return to normal areas. But the exit back to Highway 10 wasn't where she'd entered. She drove in circles, following signs that contradicted each other, passing through the same intersection multiple times from different directions, until she finally emerged onto Highway 10 nearly 30 kilometers from where Exit 47B should have returned her. She reported her findings to the ministry, submitting documentation, requesting investigation. The response was dismissive. Exit 47B didn't exist in official records, therefore it wasn't a ministry concern. If Vesper had found privately maintained roads and services, that was outside provincial jurisdiction. Her insistence on its existence, combined with her impossible documentation, raised concerns about her mental health. She was placed on administrative leave pending psychological evaluation. But Exit 47B continued appearing in Vesper's work. Every map she made, regardless of region, developed anomalies near Orangeville. Exits that shouldn't exist, roads that led nowhere, services that appeared and disappeared. The exit was spreading, or Vesper's perception of it was spreading, bleeding into her observations of other locations, making her unable to create accurate maps because she could no longer distinguish between infrastructure that actually existed and infrastructure that existed in the same unstable way Exit 47B existed. Other travelers reported similar experiences. Online forums contained scattered posts about exits near Orangeville that weren't on maps, about getting lost following highway signs, about services that existed one day and vanished the next. Most people dismissed these experiences as navigation errors, but Vesper, reading the reports, recognized the pattern. Exit 47B wasn't unique. It was one instance of something larger, a category of infrastructure that existed in superposition, real and unreal simultaneously, present in the world, but not committed to any specific configuration of presence. On March 15th, Vesper returned to Exit 47B one final time, determined to understand what it was. She took the exit, drove to the services, parked her car. But this time, instead of documenting, she simply waited, watching. The services changed while she watched. The gas station's brand shifted, the restaurant's menu altered, the motel's exterior color changed. Small details in constant flux, reality unable to settle on a single coherent version of what existed here. And Vesper understood. Exit 47B wasn't a place. It was a possibility, a location that existed in potential rather than actuality, a space where reality hadn't fully committed to being specific. She got out of her car, walked into the restaurant, sat at a booth. The server who approached her looked different each time Vesper blinked. Tall, short, young, old, male, female, all versions existing simultaneously in flickering superposition. Vesper ordered coffee, received a cup that was full, empty, and every state between, all at once. She drank the uncertain coffee and felt herself becoming uncertain too. Her identity softening, her history becoming flexible, her future branching into possibilities that all existed simultaneously. She was Vesper Morgenstern, cartographer, and she was also dozens of other versions of herself. Different career choices, different life paths, all equally real, all existing in the same moment. Exit 47B wasn't a location anomaly. It was an identity anomaly, a place where the forced coherence of singular existence broke down, where people could exist in multiple states without collapsing into single, definite versions of themselves. And by staying here, by remaining in the exit's influence, Vesper could maintain that multiplicity could be all the versions of herself that had been pruned away by reality's insistence on singularity, on definite states, on people being one specific thing rather than clouds of possibility. Vesper Morgenstern was never seen again after March 15th. Her car was found at exit 47B, or at least at the coordinates where exit 47B sometimes manifested. But the exit itself was absent that day, the location showing only empty agricultural land. Search efforts found no trace of her, no evidence of where she might have gone. But travelers on Highway 10 near Orangeville occasionally report seeing exit 47B, taking it out of curiosity or necessity, stopping at the services that exist there in uncertain configurations. And some of them report seeing a woman in the restaurant, sitting alone, drinking coffee that's both there and not there, who looks different each time they blink, who exists in too many states to be just one person, who is Vesper and not Vesper simultaneously, who is every version of herself that could have been, living all possible lives at once in a place where reality couldn't decide what was real, and so allowed everything to be real together, all possibilities maintained in perpetual superposition, all versions of identity existing without collapse, without the forced coherence that makes people singular, definite, limited to just one life lived in just one way. She exists there still, in exit 47. When it exists, drinking uncertain coffee, being all her possible selves, waiting for other travelers who are tired of being just one person, who want to exist in multiplicity, who want to take an exit that leads not to a destination, but to possibility itself, where the only certainty is that nothing is certain, where everything is real because nothing has to be specifically real, where you can be all the versions of yourself that reality usually forces you to abandon, living every path simultaneously in the place that exists and doesn't exist, that's there and not there, that you can only find when you're not looking for it, when you take an exit that shouldn't be on any map but is. That leads somewhere that's everywhere and nowhere, where Vesper waits in perpetual possibility, existing forever in the moment of becoming rather than being, maintained in the state of potential that most people only experience briefly before reality forces them to collapse into singularity, into definite existence, into lives that follow single paths through single versions of themselves, never knowing what they abandoned, never seeing the infinite possibilities they could have been if only they'd found the exit that leads to everywhere at once. If only they'd stayed there. If only they'd chosen to remain uncertain, to be multiple, to exist in all states simultaneously, like Vesper exists now. Like you could exist too if you found exit 47B and chose to stay, chose to be all your possible selves forever in the place where certainty ends and possibility never does.